I grew up in the Sierra Nevadas, a truly breathtaking part of the world with endless stretches of pine forests, rugged mountains, and crystal-clear lakes. I've never been a fan of camping, but I spent most of my childhood weekends hiking with family and friends and many summer days paddling boats on the lake. One summer when I was 16, about 10 years ago, my cousin Mara came home after her first year of college. Her boyfriend, Nico, tagged along to meet her family and friends. Nico was like a lot of visitors, eager to hike and take in the lake views. So Mara and I decided to take him on one of our favorite trails, a moderate hike through the forest up a gentle slope called Peaks at Hollow. From the tree line, you get a stunning view of Lake Tahoe below. Nico had some hiking experience, though mostly on flatter terrain, and we figured this trail would be a fun challenge with the spectacular scenery he was after. It's an in and out trail that takes about 2 to 3 hours to reach the top and another 2 to 3 hours back down. There are smaller side trails branching off, some with steep drops or winding paths down to the lake. The three of us set out on the first Saturday of his visit. The trail isn't the easiest to find, but it's a local gem because of the views and the lack of tourists. Back then it was mislabeled on the most popular trail website, so it was tricky to locate unless you knew where to look. We only passed a handful of other hikers, mostly granola-type couples with camelback hydration packs, trekking along with their dogs. We made it to the top right on time and ate lunch while gazing out at the lake. Nico was genuinely impressed with the view and spent a good chunk of time snapping photos, selfies and sandwich bites included. We mostly just chilled and got to know each other better. After about an hour of hanging out, we heard a scream in the distance, specifically a mountain lion scream. If you've never heard one before, it's downright terrifying, like a horrified woman letting out a blood-curdling shriek that freezes you in place. You can find clips on YouTube. It's an awful sound. This wasn't good news because when a mountain lion screams, it's either part of a mating ritual or two males fighting. Either way, hearing one meant there were likely multiple mountain lions nearby. Bears in the Sierras are pretty timid, but mountain lions, they'll attack you, your pets, even cyclists. They're known for it. Safety in numbers helps, but even 3 people could be at risk if you're dealing with a hungry one. Nico freaked out. He wasn't used to big predators roaming around where he's from, and the idea of an animal big enough and bold enough to eat him rattled him hard. Mara and I were on edge too, but not panicked. Between the regular natural disasters in the area, earthquakes, wildfires, massive blizzards, and the occasional deadly wildlife creeping close to town, we were pretty toughened up. We'd seen plenty of bears and snakes on hikes, and sometimes running into critters is just the price you pay for enjoying nature's beauty. It wasn't our first time hearing a mountain lion either. We'd both spotted them before, usually from the safety of a cabin or house. There was even this one time as a kid when we left some pricey steaks out in my backyard, hoping to lure a mountain lion in for photos. It didn't work, and my mom wasn't thrilled about the wasted meat anyway. Mara and I reassured Nico that it was fine, but we needed to pack up our food and head back down. We stuffed the lunch leftovers into our bags and started descending at a brisk pace. About 40 minutes into the trek back, Nico realized he'd left his phone at the lookout in our rush to leave. Naturally, there was some back and forth between him and Mara. "I don't need it that bad, Mara," he said. "Come on, Nico, all your spring break pics are on there. Not to mention you're a broke college kid. You can't just leave it." After some debate, we decided to turn back. Mara and Nico would hike up to grab his phone, and I'd stay put on the trail alone to warn any other potential hikers about the mountain lions in the area. I was mostly worried about those unleashed. Uggs like some wandering lab getting mauled. It wasn't ideal for any of us, but it seemed like the best plan at the time. I found a nice rock to sit on in the shade right by the trail, scrolling through the pics we'd taken on my phone and playing Temple Run. No cell service or internet, but I figured they'd be back soon. Mara and Nico had been gone about 50 minutes when I heard the scream again. It was hard to tell, but I thought it sounded closer than before. I started getting pretty nervous. Being in a group is way better when dealing with mountain lions, and I felt like a sitting duck out there, alone. About 20 minutes later, I heard it again, and there was no doubt this time. It was closer, coming from up the trail where Mara and Nico would be heading down. I really hoped they were okay. Logically, I knew mountain lions don't scream when they hunt. They're silent stalkers. If one was after me, I wouldn't hear it coming. The scream meant it was doing something else, something not about feeding, but that didn't calm my nerves. I got hyper alert, whipping my head around at every rustle or flicker of movement I thought I saw. I turned on my flashlight, even though it was midday, and stepped off the rock to stand in the middle of the trail so I could see up, down, and into the trees on both sides. A few minutes later, I heard it again, super close this time. Goosebumps shot up my arms, and this sinking, full-on dread hit me. I scanned around, trying to figure out the best spot to stand for cover if things went south. I ended up backing myself against a tree next to the rock I'd been on. I could still see up and down the trail and into the trees across from me. I kept watching, zeroing in on the direction I thought the scream came from. Suddenly, I saw something standing still about 20 feet away. A few feet from it was a man. He was completely naked, filthy, and scrawny, just staring at me. I hadn't even heard him approach. It was like he materialized out of nowhere, especially since I'd been so focused on looking for a mountain lion that way. If you don't know where you're going, it's easy to get lost in these woods. The weather can turn fast and people panic, getting even more lost trying to find their car. It doesn't take long alone, without food or water in the wilderness, to make someone a little unhinged, a little crazy. The infamous Donner Party incident happened maybe an hour from where I stood. My first thought was that he might be a lost hiker. Judging by how dirty he was, he'd been out there a while and needed help. I'd heard of hypothermic people stripping off their clothes, and I figured maybe that's what happened. It was July, though. No way anyone's hypothermic in summer. But that didn't click for me until later. I started walking toward him, asking if he was okay. Then, out of nowhere, I got this bad feeling. I can't even explain it fully, but my fear tripled. The hairs on my neck stood up and I stopped about 15 feet from him. This overwhelming urge to run hit me. Something felt wrong. He felt wrong, in a way I couldn't put into words. Instead of wanting to help him, I was flat out terrified of him. I asked again, "Are you okay?" He stared at me, then opened, his mouth wide, and screamed. Not a normal scream, but a mountain lion scream, high-pitched and blood-chilling. It made my whole body lock up. I thought maybe he'd been the one screaming all along. It was the scariest thing I'd ever seen. I started yelling too, ready to bolt down the trail, I guess, but I really didn't want to turn my back on him. Suddenly, he snapped his mouth shut, turned, and sprinted into the woods, crazy fast. He just vanished into the trees. That wrong feeling stuck with me, though. I felt like I was going to puke. I considered racing down the trail to get away, but decided to wait for Mara and Nico. Luckily, they showed up 10 or 15 minutes later. I told them what happened, and we agreed to call the rangers once we got service. Mara and I had seen some weird stuff in our lives, her more than me, but she went pale as a sheet when I told them. I guess they hadn't heard anything on their way down. I felt super uneasy ever since that day. Did I see a hiker with some serious mental breakdown who needed my help? Or was it something else? Mara swears it was a skinwalker or something. Like that. Something evil, inhuman, mimicking a mountain lion's call and stalking us down the mountain. This happened last Friday. I'm a 25-year-old woman with a bit of free time before picking my kid up from school. It was a gorgeous day, so I decided to spend it driving around the back roads near my hometown, listening to music. I passed this guy with his thumb out trying to catch a ride. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, carrying a fishing rod and a backpack. Seemed harmless enough, I guess. But I'm a single woman, and I've been drilled with 100 horror stories about hitchhiking gone wrong, so I just kept driving. As I drove, I had this internal guilt trip debate. If I were hitchhiking, I'd hope someone would pick me up, right? And what's the worst that could happen? Plus, I've got this new self-improvement goal to do things that scare me as often as possible. So I decided that if I looped back around and he was still walking, I'd pick him up. Absolutely. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, he was still there. Yeah, I felt a little nervous pulling over for him, but what was I supposed to do? Speed off while he's trying to get in my car? The second he climbed in, though, I realized I might have made a huge mistake. For one, he looked jittery, like he was tweaking, and he smelled awful. Second, this guy stared at me like I was a buffet and he was starving. I didn't fully grasp how rattled I was about my decision until he asked me for a cigarette. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely pull one out of the pack without snapping it. Driving helped me hide the nerves a bit, but inside I was freaking out, trying to figure out how I'd fend this guy off if he tried anything. His name was Vance, and he lived about 5 minutes from where I picked him up. While we drove, he told me he'd lost his license for drunk driving and was staying in this house with an old man. He'd tried to get the old guy to come along, but he wouldn't leave the house. Vance also kept pushing me to hang out at the place with him. Come over the next day, have some drinks, whatever. When I finally dropped him off, it was this tiny shack surrounded by a bunch of rusty old cars. He got out and tried to lure me inside with him. I said no and peeled out of there. I felt this massive wave of relief, and a little pride, honestly, for facing my fear. Fast forward to Monday, my instructor's like, "Oh my God, did you hear? Someone got killed out on this road and that road. Do you know anyone out there?" I laughed and said, "Oh, how ironic. I gave a guy a ride down that road on Friday. His name was Vance." Probably not the same thing, though. 15 minutes later, I saw Vance's picture on Facebook. Turns out the police had nabbed him for stabbing someone to death at that exact shack I dropped him off at on Friday. The details were grim. He'd stabbed the guy in the lungs, and the victim bled out. That little shack and the old man he said he lived with didn't even exist, apparently. I swear I'll never pick up another hitchhiker as long as I live. My boyfriend Milo, 27, and I, Lena, 23, had been camping for a month across different states. Everything was going really well until October 9th, when we decided to cancel our campground reservation and set up a random tent near Alabon Basin in the Uinta Mountains of Utah, not far from the secret lake trailhead. We parked around 3 p.m. The Alabon Basin campground was closed for the season, and I'll admit it felt a little nerve-wracking since this was our first time dispersed camping. We didn't have the right gear packed either. By the time we got there, we realized the spot we wanted to pitch our tent was about 2 miles uphill. At that point, we started regretting it a bit. We'd originally planned to camp in Nephi, Utah, but ditched that idea on a whim. After some grumbling and stuffing ourselves with lunch to avoid carrying extra food, we loaded our backpacks with the best supplies we had to get through the night. The forecast said it had dropped to 25 degrees 6. We hit the trail and saw the occasional family or couple coming down the mountain as we trudged up. Both of us started feeling off, like we didn't even know why we were doing this. It was as if we should have just found a hotel instead of playing backpacker for the night. But we both felt like we had something to prove, so we kept going. We got to Secret Lake fast. It was totally deserted, nothing like the pictures. It was disappointing and creepy. We pressed on, climbing higher, looking for some seclusion on flat ground. Eventually, we stumbled across a decent spot. I noticed a small cave in the distance and pointed it out to Milo, wondering if it was a safety concern. He checked it out and said it looked like a little animal den, nothing major. We set up the tent as darkness fell, played a few rounds of cards, sorted our stuff, and decided to crash early around 8:30 p.m., since we planned to leave as early as possible the next morning, maybe 5 a.m. We both drifted off slowly. About 30 minutes later, I jolted awake at 11:24 p.m. I've never felt anything like it. I was wide awake, terrified for no reason, and there was no way in hell I'd fall back asleep, even though I'm usually a solid sleeper. Milo was out, cold, so I let him be and just lay there on edge, straining to hear anything. It was dead quiet. Around midnight, Milo stirred awake, which made me so relieved. I didn't want to feel alone anymore. I told him I couldn't sleep, but he suggested I just rest since we'd be leaving early. At first, I agreed. I didn't want to seem like a baby and admit how scared I was. That didn't last long, though. Milo couldn't fall back asleep either, and soon we were both lying there trying to doze off. I finally blurted out that I was scared. We agreed we could tough it out through the night since it was already close to 2:30 a.m. We had a small axe and a pepper gun for protection, so I didn't want to be afraid. Not even 5 minutes later, we were still awake, and Milo's head shot up so fast it made my heart leap out of my chest. I whispered, "What is it?" He said, "Listen, don't you hear that?" I did. It was the sound of gravel crunching under shoes, like someone walking toward our tent, stopping, then stepping closer. My blood drained from my face instantly. In real time, it all happened in maybe 10 seconds, but my mind raced through a million thoughts. For a split second, I convinced myself it was a ranger coming to tell us we couldn't camp here. I called out, "Hello?" My brain totally sure I'd heard human footsteps. Within 2 or 3 seconds of hearing it, Milo grabbed the pepper gun and bolted out of the tent to confront whoever it was. He'd heard exactly what I had. Nothing. There was nothing there. We'd heard something walking toward us so clearly, but nothing walked away. We barely swapped 2 words before we started packing up, glancing over our shoulders the whole time. That creeping feeling of being watched hit us hard. We booked it down the mountain with just the moonlight guiding us, too scared to turn on our flashlights. That 20 to 30-minute stumble was the worst of my life. I half expected to look back and see someone trailing us. When we reached the car, we locked the doors and peeled out of the mountains, barely speaking, scared out of our minds. We hit town around 3:30 a.m. and slept in the brightly lit parking lot of a grocery store. Obviously, we've talked about that night since then. Both of us are still haunted by those footsteps. My friend and I try to go camping twice a month now that I have a reliable truck to get me to some of the more remote parts of our state. We'd planned a camping trip for the previous weekend, from February 18th to February 20th. We picked a spot pretty far out, one we'd visited the weekend before that. The time before, we were the only people we saw within a mile of our campsite. On Friday night, we got there and set up camp. This story takes place on Saturday night, around 9:03 p.m. So the sun had set long ago and the moon hadn't risen yet. It was pitch black out there except for what our campfire lit up. Suddenly we heard a man yelling. We listened intently in silence, exchanging nervous glances. At first we hoped it was just some drunk guy having too much fun, but we quickly realized this wasn't a party shout. It didn't even sound like he was hurt. It was raw, desperate, anguished, and furious. I'll take a moment to remind you. This was 9 p.m. in the dead of night, in the middle of nowhere in a forest 5 miles from the nearest cell signal. We hadn't seen another soul for hours. The screaming went on for what felt like hours, but was probably about 5 minutes. We didn't know what to do with it and started getting seriously paranoid. We gathered anything nearby that could pass for a weapon and tried to come up with explanations for the yelling while keeping an eye on the woods around us. After about 15 or 20 minutes of fear-fueled paranoia, I nearly fell out of my chair when I swung the flashlight and lantern around. Slowly walking into our camp was a stranger. I greeted him with a basic, "Hey, how's it going?" Before he got too close to the firelight, he replied quickly but bluntly, asking if we could help him with something depending on whether he could help us first. My friend and I said yes in unison, clearly tense, gripping our makeshift weapons by our sides. The stranger went on to ask if he could stay by the fire for a second, since it was just the two of us against one of him, and we had a bunch of weapons we'd collected from around the camp within reach. We decided to agree, and let him stay. After a short, awkward silence, I asked him what the hell was going on. He proceeded to tell me and my friend that he'd been camping up the trail with his buddy, and his buddy had lost it and tried to kill him. "Wait, what?" I blurted out before my brain could fully process it. "That screaming we heard earlier, was that him?" The man nodded slowly, staring into the fire, and started his story. "We were just hanging out, man. We got here earlier today and my friend just flipped out. He started screaming and yelling and wouldn't stop. Then he attacked me. He lunged at me and I told him to back off and calm down, you know? But he kept coming after me. It got pretty violent, and I was pretty sure he was going to kill me. So I grabbed the car keys, a light, and ran. I didn't know what else to do. He chased me as I bolted and I had no idea what to do. We didn't have guns or anything, but we did have an axe. My friend and I locked eyes for a second, completely stunned. Then a horrible thought hit me. Wait, he chased you? Like he's on his way here right now? The man just nodded slowly in response. And right then, like something out of a goddamn horror movie coming to life, we heard the screaming again, about 30 or 40 feet from our camp, up the main trail. "I just want your balance, Milo. I want your balance, Milo. Where are you, Milo?" I'd never in my life heard a man scream like that. I'd never heard anything like it, raspy, brutal, ear-piercing, yet deep. The sound of someone who'd completely lost their mind. The way he said the stranger's name shifted wildly, from long, drawn-out chants to short, hoarse shrieks. We turned off our lights, went silent, and listened. By some miracle, the lunatic didn't notice our camp and kept going down the trail, screaming the whole way. Eventually, we talked to the guy, we'll call him Milo, for hours listening as the yells faded into the distance. We found out they'd each taken 4.5 to 5 grams of magic mushrooms. Milo's friend, let's call him Dax, had been fine for 3.5 hours, then suddenly flew into a psychotic rage. It seemed Dax thought he could kill Milo and steal his good trip or something. We heard the screaming get farther away for over 2 hours. By then, it was 11 p.m. The moon was starting to rise and the temperature dropped below 30°. Dax hadn't taken a coat or flashlight, according to Milo. My friend and I were too buzzed to drive out of the campsite to get cell service. It was snowy and icy, and we'd have to drive 2 or 3 miles on the highway after leaving the trail. Milo was still a bit high from weed and shrooms, so he couldn't drive either. We had to decide whether to let Dax wander, hoping he'd sober up and find his way back. And he did. Oh, he came straight back to our camp. We'd been yelling for about an hour with no response when suddenly, maybe 30 to 50 feet from the camp, we heard, "Hey, help, please help me, I'm lost." We could tell the guy was coming from the woods toward our camp. We told Milo to hide, just in case, and greeted the man. I had my 12-gauge shotgun and a .40 caliber pistol in its holster. My friend carried an AK-47 style rifle and 2 9mm Glocks in holsters. With our flashlights on full blast, we shined them in his face. He was about 6'2" or 6'3", around 300 pounds. We talked to him and decided he was calm enough to walk with us. We took him back to his camp. He seemed genuinely remorseful, saying he'd blacked out and didn't remember anything, and that he'd fought with his friend. We escorted him back to his camp up the trail, then told Milo that Dak seemed okay. We said if anything else happened, he should yell and run to us. We'd come help. It ended on a happy note. We made friends with Milo, and I got his number, to make sure he got back to town safely the next day with his wife and kids. We're actually planning a camping trip with him soon. But Dax had wandered off, screaming like a maniac into the woods, possibly swinging an axe, trying to kill his friend to steal his awesome trip, or whatever the hell was going through his drug-addled mind. God help me if I ever see that guy again through my night vision scope. I'm a hunter. I love hunting wild boar in particular, though I've gone after deer and have been known to bag a turkey for Thanksgiving. I mostly hunt boar. For those who don't know, boars are a big problem in the U.S. Southeast. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to have 10 piglets or more. Since hogs eat anything and everything, it's not hard to see why the Fish and Wildlife Department legalized hunting them with almost no restrictions in my state. Hunting most big mammals with night vision or thermal scopes is illegal, except for wild boar and coyotes. I'd saved up for a year, mostly pocket money. It's tough to explain to your wife that a scope costing twice as much as the rifle it's mounted on is worth it. But I did it. I took it to a hunting range and found an area scattered with deer activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. I could easily get to it with my truck, with spots I could find to set up camp, overlooking a wide, open clearing that was easy to navigate. The night started off uneventful, mostly me fiddling with my new toy, tweaking settings. I was getting a little impatient. I'd spotted plenty of deer, but they were out of season, and as I mentioned, my setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot I'd checked out a few days earlier. It wasn't much better than the first, but it gave me something to do and a fresh angle to scan the area with my new scope. After about an hour of watching this spot, I realized it didn't have much animal activity. No rabbits, no owls. The deer I'd seen were hundreds of yards from where I stood. Why was this patch of land so dead at night when it was buzzing during the day? I'd pitched my tent around 10 p.m., and by then it was about 2 a.m. I started thinking about packing up, maybe setting up a target before I left and taking a few practice shots. Then I heard a rustling snap from the direction I'd come from. I swung my scope around and saw the shape of what looked like a small bear charging through the brush. Here's the thing. My scope isn't night vision, it's thermal, like the black and white version of what you see in Predator. I adjusted the range and zoomed in a bit. I remember jumping a little when I realized it wasn't a bear. It was a man. He was so low and hunched over that I'd thought I was looking at a cub. It couldn't be a ranger. I'd seen headlights sweep up the road from where I'd parked, and where could he have come from? I was 30 meters from anything, on public land. I was about to call out when I zeroed in and saw he wasn't wearing a damn thing, no shoes, no pants, nothing. I remember being freaked out by how he moved, like a squirrel or something, twitching and grabbing at foliage, sniffing around, pawing at the trees. That was my tree, the one I'd leaned against earlier. The thought that he might have smelled me there scared the hell out of me. Then he did something that still gives me nightmares to this day. He squatted down, put his hands on the ground between his feet, and looked straight up, like a dog about to howl. And I heard a voice coming from that direction, a sultry, feminine voice. "Help me, I'm lost." There was a long pause, but neither of us moved. My crosshairs were centered on the ground in front of him. I couldn't bring myself to aim right at another person. It went against everything I'd been taught about firearms. Where had they lost it? Was this some nutcase out here? Why was his voice so feminine? "Please help me, I can't walk," the voice said again. That's when I called bullshit. Not, only could he walk. He'd been scurrying across the terrain like a pro when I first saw him. Barefoot and all, so good I'd mistaken him for a bear. It was a fucking trap. This guy was trying to lure me over with some damsel in distress act. Luckily, the lack of action earlier had me mostly packed up. I think I might have left a hat and a seat pad behind, but I didn't give a damn. I was out of there. I took my eyes off him for a second to grab my backpack. I strapped the chest harness on and scrambled for my rifle. In a panic, I saw he was still in that crouch, but his face was staring right at me. I swear I saw a smile. Thermal scopes make animal eyes glow white. How the hell did he hear me get up and gear up? He must have been 150 yards away easy. "Fuck off," I yelled in his direction. He stood up straight, and I realized how tall and lanky he was, 6 feet at least, and rail thin. He took a few long strides toward me, and instinctively, I fired a round over his head into the tree line. He was freaky, but he wasn't technically threatening me. What would I tell the cops? I didn't want to, and wasn't ready to, shoot someone. He froze in place and dropped back down to all fours. "The next one'll fucking hit you. Get up and go." He stayed on all fours, and this time I centered my scope on him. His eyes, just above the grass, looked like a big cat's or something. I was trying to stop shaking and knew my voice cracked a bit on that last warning. I was terrified. The standoff probably lasted 1 or 2 minutes, maybe less, but it felt like forever. In a flash, he bolted left toward the trees across the trail. I could barely keep him in my scope, he moved so fast. He vanished into the brush, and I fired another round high in his direction. I shot one more and went to pocket the mag and swap it for a fresh one, but I dropped it and didn't bother looking. I wasn't far from my truck, and I wanted out. I could hear him in the distance making this weird noise. Maybe laughter, maybe crying. I sprinted up the trail to my truck, panting like crazy. I threw my gear in the cab but kept the rifle on the passenger seat and peeled out fast. I told that story from the perspective of someone who'd stumbled across a drugged-out psycho living off the land like some prehistoric freak. I reported it to Fish and Wildlife, but all they did was chew me out for hunting alone at night. Never got an update until I told the story on a camping trip. My nephew Jasper brought up Wendigos and skinwalkers, and it scared him shitless, because we were technically in the same forest where I'd seen that bastard, just 50 miles east. It freaked him out so bad his mom, my cousin Nadine, had to take him home. She was pissed. I went down a rabbit hole with those creepy tales. I'm not saying what I saw was definitely a Wendigo or a skinwalker. I'm saying if something like that exists, I might have dodged a pretty big bullet that night. Or maybe it was just some tweaker pulling a Donnie Thornberry in the middle of the night. Either way, I figured I'd share. So I'm 24 years old and have been living alone for about 2 years now. I've got this tiny bungalow that I can comfortably afford. In the bungalow there's a loft area, maybe about 5 by 5 meters, and you can really only stand upright right in the middle of it. I work night shifts at a factory, basically just sitting on my phone all night, so I usually get home around 8 a.m. Last Thursday I came home during a big storm, walked inside and crashed hard. When I woke up, I checked my phone and realized I'd been so wiped out that I hadn't looked at my notifications. I've got a Ring camera outside my door that alerts me if anyone comes near. I saw it had tripped at 7:42 a.m. I'd gotten home around 8:10 or 8:15 a.m., so I checked the footage. It showed a guy pressed up against my door fiddling with the handle. He messed with it for about 10 seconds until he spotted the camera. Then he bolted fast. It threw me off, but it didn't totally freak me out or anything. I got up to make some food and noticed something in the kitchen. My back window was open. Of course, my mind immediately jumped to a break-in, but I calmed myself down, convincing myself I'd probably left it open. The rest of the day was just me noticing little things that seemed off and scaring myself half to death, until it was time to head out for my shift at 10 p.m. I was watching TV around 9 p.m. when I caught something that made my heart leap into my throat. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the loft hatch slowly opening. I remember it so vividly I started questioning my sanity. Surely I was just hallucinating or something. I stared at it and saw something that scared me even more. Fingers curling around the hatch, pushing it open further. I didn't know what to do. I could feel real panic setting in, and I wasn't sure if I should run out of the house and call the cops or try yelling at whoever was up there. I went with both. I started dialing 911 and bolted for my bedroom where I could lock the door. The second I started running, I heard the hatch practically get ripped open from how fast they moved it. I got to my bedroom door, glanced down the hall, and caught just a sliver of the darkness up in the loft. I saw a human hand still gripping the panels on my ceiling. I yelled, "Whoever's up there, I'm calling the cops, and I've got a gun. I don't have a gun, but if you come out of there, I'll fucking shoot you." Adrenaline had my hands and voice shaking, but I tried to sound as tough as I could. Then I saw something I don't think I'll ever forget. The hand slid back into the darkness, and then he dropped down. I slammed the door shut and locked it as fast as I could. The call connected and I got through to the police. They sent officers to my place. I told them I didn't know if the guy was armed, and the dispatcher told me to stay on the line. I heard him walk up to my door and jiggle the handle. It sounded like he was rummaging through my kitchen cabinets too. I could hear a bunch of clattering. Honestly, I don't know why he stuck around. I just wanted out of the house, but he stayed right up until the cops got there. They came in and arrested him. Turns out he was a homeless guy, armed with a knife from my kitchen. He'd been spotted around the area lately, trying to break into other houses. The truth is, I'm still scared to sleep. Now I sleep with my bedroom door locked tight and all the windows shut. I keep a knife under my pillow too. I know it's unlikely to happen again, but I can't shake the image of him dropping down from my loft. That's the story of the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. I made this account just to write it out because I figured if I put it down like this, it'd feel more like a story than something that actually happened. I don't know how long all of this had been going on for sure. It was exactly a year ago when Facebook memories reminded me. I was living in a ground floor apartment in a busy pedestrian area. It used to be a corner store, so the living room. Windows were huge, with only one small window that could open. I had a really aggressive neighbor upstairs and some even angrier street vendors living across the road. I'd had to make plenty of calls to the cops and give statements. Other than that, the neighborhood was pretty nice and I got along with all my sane neighbors. One of my cats, Milo, even became a local celebrity because the haunted Halloween tours always stopped at my corner every night to tell stories. As soon as he heard them, he'd bolt from wherever he was to jump onto the open window ledge and listen while they all cooed over him. Because of the big windows, I didn't have much privacy in the living room, but I didn't mind. I'm a people watcher, and Milo loved the view too. I had curtains and sheer blinds, but you could still see right into my place. I had decent privacy in the bathroom and bedroom, though. One night, I was sitting at my computer desk in the living room, just watching YouTube and sipping a beer. I heard a group of people chatting outside, but that was normal noise for the area, and I'd have ignored it completely if I hadn't caught one of them talking right into the fan of the open window. "She's drinking beer, isn't she? usually drinks whiskey. I whipped around in my chair and heard, "Oh shit, she saw us," and the sound of them scrambling as they took off. It was dark outside, so I couldn't see them, but it sounded like at least 2 women and 2 men. I froze in place, just listening for anything else. Footsteps, their voices again. It took me a minute to fully register what I'd heard. I do usually sip whiskey at night, but that night I'd felt like trying a new beer flavor I'd picked up. These people knew my habits well enough to notice that. I was also freaked out that they knew it was whiskey because I drink out of a set of patterned tumblers. There's no way to tell what's in the glass. You can see the kitchen from the living room window, but I usually keep the whiskey in the freezer. So they must have seen me at some specific moment to know. Needless to say, I didn't sleep that night. While I was lying awake, I remembered another incident from a few nights before. I open my bedroom window at night because I sleep right under it and love the night breeze. There's a bright security light across the street, so even with the blinds down, a good amount of light hits the opposite wall. One night I woke up around 3 or 4 a.m., not unusual for me, and turned on a Netflix movie to fall back asleep. While I was lying there, I saw the shadow of a head and shoulders appear on the wall, and it stayed there way too long, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. That wasn't super common, but people have stopped to smoke outside my window before. The smell gives me a headache right away. This time, though, there was no smoke, no scent, nothing. Someone was just standing there. I couldn't tell which way they were facing, but after the recent incident, I wondered if they were looking in while they thought I was asleep. I told my coworkers about all this, and they were terrified for me. I was already planning to move, out by the end of October, just slowly taking boxes and stuff to my new place throughout the month. After they heard what happened, they all banded together and moved 75% of my stuff in one day. I told them all I cared about was my pets and my bed, but they took everything except the big furniture and anything we couldn't pack and move before midnight. I love them all so much and appreciate them every day. I had a few anxiety spikes over this, especially when I had to go back for the last of my stuff, but I feel completely safe in my new place now. I've got a full security system with sensors, and cameras too. Unfortunately, this wasn't the first or last time I've been stalked or targeted. I still visit my old apartment area sometimes because there's a great bar nearby. I don't think I'd recognize their voices, but no one's looked at me funny or given me any weird vibes since then. For some background, I live in a small apartment complex right outside my campus with some friends. I'm also a 20-year-old girl, so my friends were always teasing me for never meeting up with any guys or going on dates. I got sick of it. I didn't want to be the friend who stayed home eating pizza while everyone else was out with boys. So, I decided to sign up for Plenty of Fish. Now, I'm not the type of person who would say yes to just any random stranger. They had to be good looking, have plenty of photos, and we had to share at least 2 common interests. With those rules in mind, I psyched myself up to join the world of online dating. Within a few days, I was already talking to 2 guys. One claimed to be a doctor, which was kind of hard to believe since he was only 20. The other said he worked in construction, which seemed more plausible. I didn't think the doctor guy was lying to me, but one day while my roommates were giving me a hard time, the construction guy, let's call him Ryan, messaged me on the app we were using and asked if I wanted to grab a bite to eat. I told my roommates where I was going and who I was meeting, all the safety precautions in case I got abducted. I even set up a check-in time so that when my roommates texted me, I had to respond with a silly code word if everything was okay. If I used a different code word, it meant, "Help me get out of this," and if I didn't respond at all, they'd call the police. I quickly got ready for the date. I put my hair in a classy bun, leaving a few strands hanging down around my glasses. I wore a nice white blouse and some black pants, and I was good to go. I hopped in my car and drove to the restaurant Ryan had chosen. It was just outside my town, about a 15-minute drive from my apartment. When I arrived, I spotted him almost immediately. He was dressed nicely and looked just like his photos. He was waiting outside the restaurant doors, and his eyes lit up when he saw me. He walked over, smiled, and we chatted a little outside since it was summer and not too cold. Then we went inside. Dinner was fine. We talked about our lives, how school was going, and I got the text from my friend. Since everything was going well, I sent back the all-good code word. Ryan talked about how much he liked his job and other things, but overall the date was pretty average. The problem? Ryan was boring. He didn't do anything exciting, or talk enthusiastically about anything. It was just meh. I honestly didn't care to go on another date with him. The next day, I woke up to my phone vibrating non-stop. It was vibrating so much that it had fallen off my dresser. I almost laughed until I saw the messages were from Ryan. At first, they were all about how much fun he'd had and how he really wanted to go out again. But then, the tone changed. The messages became violent and angry because I wasn't responding. It was 7 a.m. I was sleeping. I texted him back saying I'd been asleep and that no, I wasn't interested in going out again. I was about to block him on both the app and my phone when I got one final message. Watch your back. At first I was really creeped out, but then I thought, I've blocked him, and I've deleted my accounts. What can he do? Later that day, I got a text from a random number telling me how pretty I looked in my blue PJs. I glanced outside just in time to see Ryan running down my street. How the hell did he get my number? I blocked that number and tried to go about my day. That night I fell asleep early but woke up to my phone buzzing like crazy. It was from the number I just blocked earlier that day. There were dozens of messages saying things like, "You're going to get it." I showed my roommates and they all told me to go to the police. But being stubborn, I didn't. I blocked the number again and went back to sleep. The next morning, my phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't wait. I jumped in my car and drove to the police station. They told me there wasn't much they could do except advise me to block the number. At least I had it on record. For a few days, nothing happened. The numbers stayed blocked and I thought it was over. But then the pictures started. Pictures of my house, of me and my house, my car, and even my workplace. I went back to the police, and this time, I was able to get a restraining order against Ryan. After that, I never heard from him again. Now, I never use dating websites. When I was around 6 or 7 years old, I lived next door to an older man in his 60s named Walter. He often went running around the neighborhood acting like he was very fit for his age. At the time, I lived with my grandmother, who was friends with him. She would often invite him over for tea and to chat. Things were fine for a while until one day I looked out my bedroom window. From my window, I could clearly see into his backyard. He was lying on a deck chair, masturbating. As a child, I didn't understand what was happening, of course. I assumed he didn't know I was there. The next day, I went to open my curtains in the morning and saw him doing the same thing again. This time, he looked up at me, smiled, and kept going. A few weeks went by, and I didn't mention it to my grandmother because I was afraid she'd think I was lying. But I kept seeing him almost every day. I started to realize something wasn't right when I noticed he would make an effort to get my attention by doing things like making loud noises outside or even shouting my name. Soon after, it was my birthday. My grandmother invited Walter to my party, along with most of our neighbors. At one point, I was alone in the kitchen getting a glass of water when I heard the kitchen door open. Walter walked in. He was wearing gold cycling shorts that left very little to the imagination. At the time, I thought it was just a weird fashion choice, but now I realize he wanted people to look. He said to me, "If you were my daughter, I'd never let you leave the house looking so sexy. Thank you for keeping our secret." I don't remember exactly what I said in response, but it was something like, "Sexy is a bad word." Then he started to pull down his shorts. I panicked and called for my grandmother. She rushed in to find him standing over me, quickly pulling his shorts up. He had an erection. Thankfully, I never saw him masturbating after that. My grandmother called the police and he got a warning. In my opinion, that wasn't enough for what he did. I lived next door to him for another 6 years. I'm a man in my late 20s and I work the graveyard shift, midnight to 8 a.m. At the time of this story, I lived with my wife and our newborn daughter in a third-story apartment. The front door to the apartment and a small kitchen window were both accessible from the outside, but all the other windows and the patio door, which led to the living room, were about 40 feet off the ground. We lived in a pretty safe neighborhood, but it was surrounded by some sketchy areas. Also worth noting is that the only air conditioner we had was a window unit in our master bedroom, so all three of us were sleeping in that one room. Our daughter was only a month old at the time. It was late July and blisteringly hot outside. I'm a cold weather person, so anything over 75 degrees makes me miserable. To cope, I had the windows open and the sliding patio door wide open to try to get a breeze going through the house. The only room with air conditioning was the bedroom, which made things even worse. To top it all off, I had come down with a fever that was absolutely kicking my butt. Between the fever and having a newborn, I'd only gotten about 10 hours of sleep total in the last month. On this particular night, I went out to the living room to get dressed for work, but I could barely lift my arms. You know how when you have a fever, your muscles feel like jello and everything hurts? That was me to the max. So I said, forget it, called in sick to work, and crashed on the couch in the living room. I started having intense, feverish nightmares and eventually woke up in a pool of my own sweat. I checked the clock and realized I'd only been asleep for about 30 minutes. I tried to go back to sleep when I heard this sound. Thump, thump, thump. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. The thumps continued. They weren't loud, but it felt like they were right on top of me. I listened as closely as my fever-addled brain would allow, but the noise stopped as quickly as it had started. I checked the baby monitor to make sure my daughter was okay and then went back to sleep. Thump, thump, thump. Once again, I was awake and trying to figure out what the heck that noise was. My attention was drawn to my infant daughter crying in the other room. I knew that meant she was hungry, so I peeled myself off the couch and went to the kitchen to make her a bottle. My wife came out of the bedroom, unaware that I was home, and gasped in surprise, which startled me too. I turned toward her to reassure her, which put the living room and patio in my line of sight. As I was saying, "It's okay, it's just me," I saw something fall from the roof onto the patio. A moment later, a man dressed head to toe in black dropped down from the roof of our 3-story building onto my patio. My feverish, sleep-deprived brain went into full panic mode. I tried to shout something, but all that came out was a loud, panicked scream. I took off running from the kitchen toward the patio door, which was wide open. The only thing keeping this guy out was the flimsiest screen door, which wasn't even locked. I was moving like I had cement blocks for feet thanks to the fever. Luckily, he heard my incoherent yell and saw me running toward him in the dark. He decided to scurry back up onto the roof like some kind of ninja. Thump, thump, thump. I slammed the patio door shut and locked it. My wife ran off to call 911 while I waited for the police to arrive. I noticed that the intruder had left his duffel bag on the deck. When the police showed up, they investigated the bag, and I was horrified by what they found inside. Zip ties, duct tape, condoms, disposable cameras, rope, a rather sizable dildo, a couple of box cutters, and a large hunting knife. I have no doubt about what this man intended to do that night. If I hadn't decided to stay home, I don't know what would have stopped him. My husband and I moved into our house about 9 months ago. At first, the neighbors seemed okay. We're the kind of people who keep to ourselves. But there's a woman who lives directly across the street. Let's call her Margot. On Mother's Day, as my husband and I were leaving for brunch, Margot wished me a happy Mother's Day, and I wished her the same. She started walking toward our driveway as we were pulling out, and not wanting to be rude, I rolled down the window and told her we were in a hurry but could talk when we got back. She became hysterical, yelling obscenities and throwing her hands in the air. My husband drove off, and when we returned, we noticed 3 of the 4 planters on pedestals outside our front door had been knocked over. As we got out of the car, Margot ran out of her house and stood at the end of her driveway. She didn't say anything, she just watched us. We decided to go to the store, replace the planters, and clean everything up. When we put up the new planters, we also installed 6 Wi-Fi security cameras in our windows, just in case she tried something like that again. As we were cleaning up, Margot came out again, this time bringing a chair to the end of her driveway to watch us. A neighbor came over and told us that the landlord should have warned us about Margot. He explained that she sometimes acts out if she feels slighted or disrespected. We told him we weren't there for her entertainment or companionship and that she needed to stay away from our property. The next day, when we left for work, Margot ran outside in a nightgown and stood at the end of her driveway with her arms folded. When we got home, we saw that the planters had been moved but not knocked over this time. We weighed them down with rocks and checked the security footage. It showed 2 girls, around 6 and 8 years old, coming from Margot's house. They tried to push over the planters, and when they couldn't, they went back inside. We called the police to document the incident in case Margot decided to escalate things. For the next 2 months, every time there was movement in front of our house, Margot would run outside if she was home. We decided to ignore her since it was clear she was mentally unstable. One day when we came home from work, she blocked our driveway with her car. We called the police, who made her move it but didn't do anything else. We explained the situation to the officer, who told us to keep records of her behavior and call if she made contact with us. A week later, she blocked our driveway again. This time, the police gave her a ticket. Margot continued to run outside whenever there was movement. But now she would also pull up in her car about a minute before we got home, wait in her car, and get out when we did. This happened no matter what time we got home. One night we noticed she was pulling out of a driveway at the end of the block. After that, we started using another entrance into the neighborhood. This worked for about a week until she started waiting at that entrance and following us in. I began recording these incidents with my phone. About a month ago, things escalated. I came home for lunch and found a huge trailer blocking my driveway. I asked the driver to move, but he refused, saying he was a friend of Margot's and was visiting her. I told him to move or I'd call the police. He moved, but then parked the trailer again after I parked my car. I called the police and the number on the side of the trailer. The owner of the trailer apologized and said it shouldn't have been in a residential area. The police ticketed the trailer and made the driver leave. The man visiting Margot was arrested for outstanding warrants related to unauthorized entry and criminal trespassing. About a week after that, Margot followed us into the neighborhood, parked her car, and ran to the end of our driveway. She yelled about us contacting the trucking company and called us stupid for doing it. When she saw I was recording her with my phone, She turned around and went back to her driveway. We called the police, who took another report and warned her to stay away from us and our property. She ranted about how we didn't own the house, and how she could go anywhere she wanted on our property. The officer warned her that if she came onto our property again, she could be arrested. About a week ago, a group of kids came onto our property, started fighting on the front lawn, and threw trash everywhere. Margot sat on her porch and yelled for the kids to fight louder and make more noise. We called the police, but the officer said they were just kids playing and denied being sent by Margot. We showed the officer the video, but he still refused to do anything. He just told Margot to stay away from us, a warning she's ignored multiple times. The day after that, it was 40 degrees outside, and Margot came out and stood in the middle of the street watching us. She's continued to do this every day, including this morning. It's obvious the police aren't going to do anything. We have 3 months left on our lease, and needless to say, we're moving as soon as it's up. Until then, we'll keep calling the police and saving the video recordings of her stalking and harassing us.